it doesn't have to be a billion people at once. It could be 100 here, another 100 here. You know what I mean? It doesn't have to be slow either. That's up to us. I firmly believe that.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's the thing. I mean, there's belief and then there's doing.
Yeah.
And, there are a lot of people who are doing things. I mean, I've admitted many times on different podcasts and different radio programs that I've never seen in action some of these devices, but it's pretty obvious if you just look at nature. For instance, people say levitation and zero gravity is not possible, but I read in Tesla's autobiography how he came across the notion of anti-gravity, and that was by looking at clouds. Because the clouds, you've got, a million tons of water just suspended right there in air.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's anti-gravity. And people say, well, that's because it turns into a gas or a vapor. Well, actually, it's not necessarily true. There's actual water particles, droplets attached to dust, and really they're just waiting for a signal from nature to drop, which, no coincidence, Tesla said was lightning.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's just, he had a different way of looking at things that's underrepresented and underexplored, and that is through this sort of process of looking at nature and sort of following what nature has to say about certain things and then allowing nature to guide you as opposed to our preconceived notions of things.
I just found out recently that he followed a Swami, right? Do you think that had something to do with like why he was so in tune with nature? Because it seemed like it was from birth, through his life. If anything, it just would have expanded it, learning from a Swami. But I didn't even know he met a Swami, honestly. I just find it fascinating that he did.
Let's put it into context here. I mean, he came from a completely different era. I mean, he was born in 1856. The natural world was in pretty pristine condition. It was in a condition that, most everybody was in a much closer proximity and relationship to nature than we are today.
True.
And I've spent, decades reading and writing and thinking about Mayan cosmology and their whole idea of what animism is, right? This whole animistic idea that all things in nature have a consciousness quality and can be activated through our interaction. And that's the core principle of animism. Mm-hmm. Well, I see Tesla as a kind of a shaman.
Nice.
For technology the way we have it today. But it had to come from somewhere. And for him, if you read his autobiography, it's all coming from nature.
That's pretty cool. I never looked at him as a shaman. I love that. That's great.
Well, he is a shaman because what does a shaman do? A shaman interacts with the
other worlds.
The other worlds through natural interaction with nature, whether it be through some sort of psychedelic or some sort of trial of endurance. True. Or some sort of thing, and it creates a collective vision for the people. That's what a shaman does. That's the historical job description of a shaman, is to go and get collective vision, to heal people, to do all those types of things. But really a shaman is to interact with the unseen forces of nature in order to bring about fortuitous natural events so that you can have good crops and good, victories in war and all the rest of it. That's what the shaman is in Mesoamerican culture. You translate that to Tesla, you have this fellow who understands these unseen forces in nature out of a period in time where nobody knew these things. Or nobody had made them mainstream or could harness them, let's just say. And then he harnessed them in service to man, and that is his mission statement. If you've ever read his mission statement, that is his mission statement. He wants to harness nature for the benefit of man, despite the fact man is, stupendously self-destructive. And anyway, so he has some issues. He's not a perfect person, but he had some very interesting insights, and this is how I see him. I see him as a shaman of a new kind. The first techno-shaman, forces of nature, not just interact with them, but harness them into what we call technology. And that's how I see him. That's how I want to portray him.
I love that. No, I love that because it touches on this spirituality, which I'm a big advocate of. But at the same time, it doesn't scare people away. It just kind of gives you a nice overview of,
Yeah, I'm sort of talking in a direct format. I wouldn't necessarily portray it so directly because there's some fun to play with there in the mystery. It's like, how does this person come across these things? Like, what was he doing? How did he physically do it to figure out what was happening or how the ionosphere was interacting with the solar wind? How did he physically figure that out? There's just things about Tesla that remain a mystery today that we'll never know because we can't ask him. And because a good portion of his work is either in top secret archives or has been destroyed or he never wrote it down. And yet we have these great outcomes: AC current, X-rays, lasers, remote control, wireless communication, all these things. And when you start going through the laundry list of things that are provable that he did, that we understand, that have been built upon, then why is it so hard for people to understand that he used the interaction between the ionosphere and the Earth's resonance to figure out a way to harness the energy spewing in from space? Why is that so hard to understand? That's the bridge I'm trying to gap, or the gap I'm trying to bridge. That's what I see us trying to do with this series, is not necessarily take it head on, but through the course of many seasons, if possible, start cultivating this inevitability of his life, that he would come to that. And that by the time we come to it in the story, people are just so willing to look at it that they're not running away from it.
True. I agree with all of that. That's really, really, really good.
Now, your question about Swami, I mean, I have questions about Jesus Christ.
Nice.
I have questions about him going to India at some point.
Yeah.
That type of thing. These are just rumors. I don't know anything. How can I know anything, right? About that. That's just truth number one. How can I know? I don't know.
Sure.
But I can also, there's a really interesting book out there that I think might change a lot of people's mind about collective conscience, and that is a book called The Power versus Force.
Heard of it.
Yeah, it's worth reading. It's basically rooted in kinesiology, and it shows how the body can be a barometer for asking any question, getting a positive or negative answer through its physical response. And so that you can ask any question of your body, really. You can state a question, and then you can do a physical test to see if you have a strong response or a negative response. Like a weak or a strong, right? And a strong response would indicate yes, and a weak one would indicate no. And so one can ask, did Jesus Christ go to India? And get a physical response. And the interesting thing about that is that anybody around the world can ask that question and get the same physical response, whether they even speak English or not. It's an interesting book. You got to read it if everybody's interested in sort of tapping into collective conscience. This is an actual... I don't know if I wouldn't say proven. I've read the book. I've tried the tests myself with a bunch of friends. We came out with the same answers. It's kind of unusual. So it's worth reading and exploring. It's called Power versus Force. The writer is David Hawkins. So it's worth reading. It's worth exploring. And it's a way of kind of tapping into some of these forces that through the body, not the mind, not the thinking apparatus, but the body's ability to respond physically as an indication of truth or falsehood. And that's very interesting. So yeah, so as far as Tesla and the Swami, I think he was also. I don't have all the details because that's part of what we want to develop in this series. That's why we are raising money. Is to do a more exhaustive research on the timetable of where he went and what he did when he was there. So that would fit into your question about this Swami. Like, we've heard these things. I want to know.
Well, like I said, I heard about this, and I've followed, many things about Tesla. I've researched many hours and days and weeks and months, whatever you want to call it. I never heard about the Swami until like 2 months ago. I was like, there it is. There's that other key for understanding who Tesla was, because there was this gap. I felt like you had him, visualizing things, using his imagination, and then, finishing a project like perfectly every time after building in his mind. I was like, well, that's amazing, but there was this, as he kept going and evolving and advancing, there was like this missing part, or whatever. And then when I found out about the Swami, I was like, all right, this kind of makes sense now,
Yeah, there's other things too. I mean, you got to consider in terms of the historical record. I mean, they were just getting into Egypt. Archaeologists were just getting into Egypt at the time. They were discovering King Tut's tomb. They were looking at the pyramids in a different way. I mean, it's like the collective conscience refocused back to that area and went after the pyramids. Now, I don't know if anybody out there has ever heard of these theories, but there is a theory, and it's been pretty well demonstrated that it's possible that the major pyramids at Giza were actually free energy devices. The stone that they're built of is conductive. There are almost power ways, and they were using the aquifers underneath to create, or essentially accumulate, ionospheric energy that would then interact with the ionosphere itself and create a power wave that would distribute through the aquifers, and people could plug into the earth and use, electricity. This is a theory. Now, I know he went to Egypt. I know that he was exposed to a lot of these things early on, and he may have come up with those ideas, or many of the ideas of wireless systems, by going to Egypt and observing the pyramids in Giza.
Who knows? Or even meditating. He might just, if he was into meditations. We know that he visualized things in his mind. Like, that's a fact.
Yeah,
as far as, it's hard to prove, but you can't prove that. But
his autobiography speaks about it. Everybody that ever read anything, wrote anything about him, and knew him in a favorable fashion talks about it.
Yeah. So just time, multiply that. Go to the Egypt, meet a Swami. He helps him advance in meditation, helps him get clearer and clearer and clearer. And there you go. It actually makes perfect sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, when he was young, he did have these attacks of light in his mind that he had to learn to control. He had to learn to control them. How he learned to control them, he doesn't get into that in his autobiography. But it's pretty clear that there's all kinds of forms of meditation. Any kind of focused attention on anything in order to overcome something is a type of meditation, whether you're sitting cross-legged like a Buddha or not. So yeah, it's undoubtedly true that he was meditating.
Fascinating.
I would say that's a given, because he had something to overcome. He was trying to overcome this 3D imaginary world that kept appearing in his mind that was overwhelming his senses, his sense organs, so he couldn't really tell the physical world from this 3D world that was overwhelming his mind. He explains this very detailed fashion in his autobiography.
I don't think I've read that. I really need to read that.
Everybody needs to read Tesla's autobiography. It's his words. It's his voice talking about himself. And it's a very short read. You can pick it up. It takes you about a day and a half to read if you're like me and you just don't put a book down.
Yeah.
Or it could take you a week, doesn't matter. But the point is you'll get through it very quickly, and it'll completely awaken your mind to a lot of things about Tesla that, really explain away a lot of his idiosyncrasies. He really was a savant, one would call them back then. That was the word they used. Today they would call it autistic. He would have been on the autistic spectrum for sure. Mm-hmm. He would have been diagnosed today as that. He might have been diagnosed as bipolar as well, because bipolar has a tendency to have hallucinations. Mm-hmm. Extreme bipolar can have hallucinations. He might have been a little bit of both. I don't think he was extreme on either end, because he was very functional. He was very socially driven. So he wasn't extreme necessarily on any of those cases, but he certainly had elements of those. I know a guy who's a good writer that I work with that he's on the spectrum of autism. And he's a very interesting character. He can socialize, no problem, but he's out there, And his talent is accumulating information and going through vast sums of information, boiling it down to a storyline very quickly. But anyway, Tesla certainly would have been a bit of an autistic person. Mm-hmm. He was also driven by some pretty deep-seated emotions. There's this idea, by the way, that he was completely abstinent from sex. It's not true. He just didn't marry. He had sex with prostitutes all the time.
I didn't know that.
He was He was